Hey there, and welcome back to the Parkinson's Disease Education Podcast. Most Parkinson's drugs either flood the brain with dopamine or they turn on dopamine receptors everywhere in the brain. That's where Tavapadon is different. We're going to be discussing Tavapadon in this episode, and Tavapadon is designed to turn on the right dopamine pathway in a specific way and not overstimulate the rest of the dopamine receptors in the brain. And that's what sets it apart from other medications and from other dopamine agonists. Join me for this episode. On the other side of the intro, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Hit it. Welcome to the Parkinson's Disease Education Show, where we demystify the disease and empower you as the person with Parkinson's disease to reach your true potential. The content contained on this show is for informational purposes only and is not meant to be a replacement for information or advice that you receive from your in-person medical or therapy professionals. If you haven't already, I hope you'll consider subscribing, and for an even more personalized experience, please ask us about our memberships. Now, without further ado, let's start the show. So to dive into the mechanism of dopamine agonists, and of course Tavapadon specifically, it's important to talk about how the motor pathways work in the brain, particularly as it pertains to the dopamine receptors. And there's multiple dopamine receptors. The first ones we're going to talk about are D1 and D2 and D3. So D1 receptors are the so-called direct pathway, meaning those are the go signal for our brain to initiate movement. The indirect pathway operates through the D2 and D3 receptors, and those are essentially the stop signal. So in Parkinson's disease, there's a breakdown in the operation of those receptors. Of course, dopamine production is affected by Parkinson's, but the receptors play a role in regulating that pathway. And so in Parkinson's, essentially the go signal is weak, and at times the stop signal can be too strong. So hence you get issues with slow movements, small movements, and you also get freezing episodes and the like. So existing dopamine agonists that are currently out on the market include pramipexole, ropinirole, and rotigotine. Typically, those stimulate the D2 and D3 receptors, which are the stop side of the dopaminergic system. That can definitely help, but it's not very selective in particular. So that's actually wherein lies the problem, because D2 and D3 receptors particularly live in parts of the brain that help us to control things like reward and pleasure, impulse, sleep regulation, and perception. And that's why we tend to see those negative side effects that sometimes come along with dopamine agonists, like impulse control issues, gambling addiction, sexual addiction, and the like. Also, hallucinations can happen, and daytime sleep attacks. So this is where Tavapadon is different. Now, if you haven't heard about it, Tavapadon is a brand new dopamine agonist medication that has just hit the market in 2025, I believe the latter part of the year. And it's said to have much better results in those taking it than some of the current dopamine agonist medications we mentioned earlier. And the big difference is that Tavapadon targets the D1 receptors in the brain. That's our go pathway. The reason that's significant is because the D1 receptors basically are a direct switch, if you will, to turn on the motor pathway in the brain. So you could think of it as an analogy of the typical dopamine agonists step on the brake pedal while Tavapadon steps on the proverbial gas pedal. The second major difference with Tavapadon is it's a partial agonist, meaning most dopamine agonists basically give it the big guns, stimulating those receptors, the D2 and D3 receptors, with everything that they've got, and that basically that's a less controlled stimulation of dopamine release. But Tavapadon is a partial agonist, which means that it gives the dopamine receptor just enough activation to work. And you could think of it as an electrical analogy as a dimmer switch versus just an on-off switch. So it's a kind of a ramp up versus just it's on or off. And the reason that that's significant is because when you stimulate dopamine receptors with everything you've got, eventually you can get what's called receptor burnout, where they essentially become almost resistant to the drug. So when they become less responsive, that tends to be as a result of desensitization to the medication itself. So Tavapadon was designed to avoid that by having that partial stimulation. The receptors can stay responsive for a longer period of time. Lastly, Tavapadon avoids stimulating those receptors we mentioned earlier that tend to result in those problematic side effects of the impulse control issues, hallucinations, as well as dopamine addiction behaviors. So the idea, though, instead of stimulating the D2 and D3 receptors, that D1 receptor helps with better movement and fewer of the psychiatric side effects that could come along with the other dopamine agonists. Sounds like a win-win. So where this compares to levodopa is that Tavapadon does not provide synthetic dopamine for the brain to use for regulating movement and other functions of dopamine. That's what levodopa does. It raises dopamine levels throughout the entire brain, and it works, it's powerful, but it's messy. It's not a very controlled mechanism. Tavapadon does not, as I mentioned, raise the dopamine levels. It just selectively interacts with those specific receptors in the brain, and those specific ones, as I mentioned, are the most important for movement. So hopefully other medications that come along are a little more targeted, just like this one is, because precision, as time moves on, precision is going to be the most important way to deal with Parkinson's symptoms in terms of a pharmaceutical approach. So in short, and one key takeaway from this episode is that Tavapadon is not just another run-of-the-mill dopamine agonist. It's a true targeted, fine-tuned D1 receptor agonist, and it's designed specifically to restore movement without also stimulating those impulse and reward and hallucination circuits that tend to be problematic with other medications. So we'll see where this takes us, but I think that this is a very promising look at managing Parkinson's symptoms with a pharmaceutical approach. Now, you can imagine a drug like this combined with carbidopa, levodopa, if necessary, would be a pretty powerful way to add on to the benefits of improving symptoms without adding more and more levodopa doses throughout the day. As time goes on, levodopa becomes less and less effective. Similarly to the reasons we discussed with the dopamine receptors, it takes more and more dopamine or levodopa over time to have an effective dose, because the brain essentially becomes desensitized to it. So you have to, you might go from taking carbidopa, levodopa 2-3 times a day to taking 3 or 4 pills every 2 to 4 hours, or even, yeah, that's probably about the most I've heard. So it's definitely a promising thing to have this new drug on the market. Drugs are often touted as the number one way to deal with Parkinson's, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But if we are going to develop drugs to manage Parkinson's symptoms, I think this one could be a winner. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you learned something new, and I know I did when I researched it for you. For those of you who took place in the trials when Tavapadon was being developed, or you're taking it currently, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments, and look forward to that conversation when that comes. Thanks for being here today. Look forward to seeing you in the next episode. As always, be empowered. I'll catch you next time.